Hello, my friends, and welcome to another Penpot hands-on session. This is a session where I'm going to demo a whole bunch of cool flex layout stuff to you, and I can answer any of your questions live. So please ask questions. I am live, unless you're watching this video back later on. And so if you have any questions, particularly about flex layout in Penpot, you can just type them in on the comments on the platform that you're watching this on. And then I will do my best to answer them live. I've got a section today called the Flex Doctor. And the idea is that I'll be able to solve any problems that you're having with Flex. And so if you have any questions related to that, just jump into the comments and let me know. So first off, what is Penpot? Penpot is the open source design tool for both designers and for developers. And Flex is a really great part of that because Flex is actually a concept that has come from development, and Penpot has made that accessible for designers to design with in the design tool. How many times can I say design in one sentence? And Penpot 2.5 is out today. Now, nobody asked me to say anything about this, but there's actually a few really cool features that have just turned up in 2.5, and I'm actually going to show you those as part of the demo because they're really useful and they're features I've been looking forward to all this time. So I think we'll kick things off by understanding Flex layout. Let's get back to So here in my Penpot file, I am going to go into the assets where I've got a few components ready for this demo. So under Flex, I can pull in my, hang on a second. Sorry, Alma, if you can hear me, I can hear you. Just letting our producer know that I've got some noise going on. Perfect, fabulous. Right, so I'm going to pull in an F and an L and an E and an X. And so these are just components that I've pulled in, but these are just some shapes. And these are going to be my initial blocks. And I'm going to add these blocks to a board. Boards are very important in Penpot. Pretty much everything you can do happens on a board. And I'm just going to name this Flex Layout so we know what we're doing. Now, I am going to start off by showing you something that's slightly unrelated to Flex, but is very cool. And I want to add a color fill to the background here. And this is a new feature as of today in Penpot, which is a multi-stop gradient. Now, of course, I've zoomed in my browser, so I have to zoom out so we can see the whole of that interface. So now you could previously add linear gradients with one stop at either end, but now you can add multiple stops throughout. So I'm going to make a groovy purple background. And so I can start off with two different purples, and then I can click in the middle of the gradient here and add maybe a couple more different shades of purple in there. Oh, I think that's a bit garish. I'm going to go slightly darker. And see, I can drag around. I don't have to use pre-picked colors as well. And I'll zoom out a touch more. There you go. You can see that this is at 100% opacity, my gradient, just because I've added so many options to the list here. And so this is my cool gradient that I've got going on. If I go back to select that gradient again, what I also want to do is I'm going to make it diagonal and just drag the stop from the beginning and the stop from the end, because that's a bit more of a smoother, cooler looking gradient too. So just thought I'd show you that because it's cool. I'll zoom back in again just to help you see the UI a little bit better. Now for each of my blocks, I want to add a colored background. This is just to help you see what I'm doing. Now I'm going to do this by starting adding a flex layout to the block itself. And what this does, and it's just a useful side effect of Flex, even if you're not laying out multiple elements, if you apply Flex layout to a shape or an object, you can add padding and other like spacing around it that will stay the same regardless of the shape of the object that you've got in there. And that's really useful if you're building designs that are changing quite frequently. Maybe you've got icons and you might switch it out for a different icon later, and you want the spacing to be kept consistent. So I'm going to add a flex layout, and the orientation and the alignment doesn't really matter right now because it's just one object. But what I'm going to add is some padding. I'm going to add 10, is that big enough? 20. So I'm adding 20 at the top and the bottom and the left and the right. You can see that at the moment my shape is kind of jumping outside of the box, and that's because the box itself has a fixed height and width. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the flex board settings so that it fits the content of the container. And so now I have that nicely spaced out, and I'll add a background to the board so we can see that spacing when we haven't got the object selected. So I'm going to make that light purple. And so I have a little box. This is really cool, but I want these styles to be applied to each of these boxes. And this is a game changer. It's one of those, we were discussing this just before the live stream. It's one of the features that you don't notice how much you miss it. And it is copy and pasting styles, or properties as they're called in Penpot. So I've got my object selected and I want to copy the background color and the layout, and I want it to be applied to each of these. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to copy paste as, copy properties. Note, you can also copy a CSS. So I'm going to copy the properties, and then I'm going to select my other objects and I'm going to paste those properties. So that is very cool, very quick. And I'm going to add a stroke to this so that we can see it a little better. Now I have my little box example. Now, maybe I want to resize my board to fit the objects inside it. That's another new feature. This is something I hadn't even thought about is so useful, and then I realized I use this all the time. Even just today, I've just used it constantly. And it's this little arrows all pointing inwards. And if I just hit that, it will resize the board to fit all of my contents. Now, let's go on with some flex layout. So I want to lay out the blocks inside this board using flex. So I'm going to go to the layout section in the design tab and add a plus, flex layout. What this has done automatically is grabbed my object and made a layout roughly using how they were already laid out. So it's approximated it for me. That's why I've got a spacing in between the objects of 48.56. That's just an approximation of what it was between the objects previously. So it's a really handy default, especially if you've started off laying out your elements statically and you want something similar rather than adding a layout and everything gets thrown around. So I'm going to put a little bit of spacing in between those. I'll put 20 in between. Because these are all laid out in a row, it's only giving me the option for the gap between the items horizontally and not vertically. If I was going the other direction, this would be enabled as well. And if I was wrapping, both are available. So this is currently going from right to left, or row reverse. I want them to actually be ordered left to right. I think this is very important if you're building something that's going to be translated into code later on, because the order of things is very important in the code. And so I like to make sure that my layers keep that same order. Once you have a flex layout, you have flex layout applied to a container. If you go to the layers panel, you can actually change the order of the objects very quickly by selecting them in the layers panel and using the arrow keys on your keyboard to just go up and down to move them into the right order. So it's really quick if you just want to reorder the name of the letters. Now I've realized I haven't got any spacing around the outside of my box, so I'm going to add some padding. And so that's given a nice bit of spacing around my box. Now, the size of my board is the size that it was set to previously when I chose to resize the board. What I want to do is I want to make sure that the board fits the size of its contents. This is what you'll probably use most often if you're using flex layouts inside other flex layouts. So I'm going to set the width to fit the content and the height to fit the content too. Now, because this layout is everything's aligned to the left, if I change the width of the board, you can't really see much difference. What if I align my contents to the middle? And then I change the width of the board. You're starting to see how Flex might work in that way. What if I decide I want to lay my contents out in a different direction? Maybe I want to lay them out from top to bottom. And you can see that it will stay in the center there, or I can align them to the outside. I can align them to the top. I can align them to the bottom. I can space them evenly as well. What if I want to make the objects, and this is probably much more common in galleries and card lists and things like that. I want to make my objects wrap to fit the available space. I'm going to go from left to right. And so what this will do is, depending on the space available, it will wrap those objects around. I think that is really handy too. Now, one note I should make right here, and I will bring this up again later because it's a Flex Doctor situation. And it's something that took me a while to get my head around when I started using Flex Layout in Penpot. And that is, it's really cool dragging the board around to show yourself how a responsive design might work. However, if you have multiple layouts inside your board, when you drag things like this, Penpot will be very clever and it will go, oh, okay, you want the contents inside here to adapt their width as well. And so you may end up with objects inside that previously had were set to full width, or in fact, only if they're set to full width, they may end up being set to fixed width. Because when I'm dragging this, I'm saying, change the size of the board. I'm not just playing with the layout. I hope that makes sense. Let me know in the comments if it doesn't make sense. So just a quick reminder as well, everything that I do here in this file today, it's going to be a messy file, but I will upload it to the Penpot community as soon as the stream is over. So you'll be able to grab this file and play with it and see everything that I've done in detail, especially if you're catching up on this video later on down the line. So next up, why don't we look at styling buttons with Flex Layout? I'm just going to move this so that I can't see it anymore because it's distracting. And I'm going to make another board here. And this I'm just going to call button for the sake of us being able to find it later on. I know, a bit of a darker background. It's a bit eye-hurty with white on a grey background. So I'm going to start off by creating a button. Now, when you're going to start drawing a button for the first time, the temptation will be, let's draw in that background. But if you want to use Flex Layout and take advantage of Flex Layout, I say leave the background till later, and you'll see why in a moment. So I have some items that I've saved from earlier for my button. When I say items, I mean an icon. So this is in the assets panel. I'm not sure why that's being a little slow to load right now. That's probably my internet connection. So I'm going to drag this checkbox icon into just onto my board. So I'm going to have an icon and some text in my button. So my text, I'm going to call this save changes. And that's actually quite a nice style that I was playing with earlier. Maybe a different style will fit better. Hang on, I'm just gonna do a quick refresh. Hope my internet starts behaving a bit better. There we go. Right. So I've got my save changes text there as well. So this is the beginning of my button. I have an icon and I have some text. Now I'm going to put these together in a Flex layout because I want to be able to align them to each other inside my button. So I'm going to right click and add Flex Layout. I can also do that. I don't have to add it from the design panel. And again, the Penpot has chosen some sensible options based on my previous static layout. So it's gone from row reverse. Again, I want to switch that around. I want to add maybe 15 in between. Now, if I go to my layers, confusingly call this layer button as well. And like I said before, if you want to very easily change the order of the items, you can use the arrow keys, or you can drag them around as well. And you see they're still inside that flex layout. So I have my button contents. Now, because I've added a flex layout, earlier I told you, don't add a background yet. Now I've added my flex layout, I can add my background to that flex layout. Now, the advantage of this is that my background will always fill the whole of the size of the button. So if the contents of the button changes, the fill will flex to fit the contents. Why don't I go for another linear gradient? That's a bit of fun. I know, I'm going to go very skeuomorphic. I don't know if the rest of you are as ancient as I am, but back in the day, not long after I started doing web design, it was really trendy to create designs that looked as much like a real life object as possible. And this is called skeuomorphism, a very fancy word for something that's quite simple. And so creating a button that looked like it was glossy and shiny and like it really stood out from the page was how we really love to do things. So I'm going to do that now, a really retro button. Oh, I was wondering why my button was so grey. It's because it's not 100%. Its background color is showing through. There we go. Zoom in. So that's looking delightfully naff. See, it looks like it's sticking out from the background. And I'll zoom back in. And so I've got no padding on my button right now. It's just stuck to the outsides of the text and the icon. So I'm going to add some padding to my flex layout, maybe 15. Oh, that's too big. 5 and 10 on the outside. Yeah. Because there's actually too much space in between the icon there, but also because there's this icon's round, like optically, this, even though there's the same amount of space on either side, this feels much bigger than that side. So I'm actually going to go to the padding. This gives me the choice to add different padding to each side. And on the left side, I think that's okay, but I'm actually just going to tweak the right side so that optically it looks evenly weighted with the other side. And now I've decided I want more vertical padding as well. So I'm going to make that 7. And then I'm going to add some rounded corners, because what is a button if it doesn't have rounded corners? Add a nice chunky stroke. That was very trendy then as well. Make that a nice green too. And of course, we have to make it look like the text is printed, like embedded and embossed on the button itself. So the way we would do that is with a text shadow. So I'm going to go down to the shadow options, and I'm going to add myself a nice, and go dark green again, shadow. Oh yeah, that's really extreme. Wrong direction though. You see at the moment it looks like the light's coming from the top, but if it's embossed, it should be the other direction. So I'm going to tighten up that blur, and I want it to be directly above the text. So I'm going to have 0 x-axis and -2 on the y-axis. Actually, maybe -1 will look a bit more realistic. So there we go. That's a very, now looks very into. Laura, your late 2000s design skills are on point. And yet again, now I've got the shadow that I want on the text. I want to have that same shadow on my icon, so that it all feels like it's embossed. So I'm going to go back to copy paste as, and I'm going to copy those properties, that 2.5 feature, and I'm going to go into the icon and paste it in there. So there we go. We have a flexible, very naff button. And you can see if I change the size of my button, maybe I want to make sure that the text is always center aligned. So I can have a different sized thing. I can make it wrap. So if the button becomes too narrow, then maybe the icon gets center aligned. That's pretty handy, isn't it? So that is my very naff button. Right, so do we have any questions? As I mentioned earlier, if you are on any platform watching this, you should be able to ask questions in the comments under the video and we can pull them into the live stream here. Otherwise, you can always go onto the Penpot community and ask your questions and I can get to them later on. And at the end of this live stream, we will have a Flex Doctor section where I can help you debug your layouts if you're having any trouble with them. Okay, so if we don't have any questions, we can move on to the next section, which is navigation layouts. So what Flex was really designed for was being able to create responsive layouts. This is the benefit of having things that flex around your content, is to be able to create layouts that work on any kind of device or any size. And so, for example, maybe you're a person who doesn't have their web browser full width. I like to often use mine half width and have one page side by side with another page. If we build our layouts flexibly and responsively, they can fit these layouts that the users are using, regardless of their devices, regardless of their environments, and it makes our designs more future-proof too. Back in the day, we used to design for like very fixed web browser sizes. Originally, it was like 800 by 600 pixels, then it was 1024 pixels wide, but now it could be any size. And so by making designs that fit any of these widths, we're making things more future-proof, but we're also not having to design for every different size individually, because that takes forever. So I'm going to create another board in the same section, but I'm just going to move out of the way so we don't get distracted by the other things there. So I add a board. Now, one of the cool things about Penpot is we have these size presets, and I'm going to start off by using and do mobile size. Oh, you know what? I'm going to go very unlike me, and I'm going to go for Android mobile. I'm just going to call this board mobile. Now, maybe I'm going to create some navigation. So I'm going to my assets to see some bits that I prepared earlier, because you know that I hate typing in front of you all because I always spell things wrong. I'm going to drag. So my mobile navigation, it's got a little logo in it for Aquaflux, and it's got some links. Now, I have actually even numbered these, so I put them in the correct order. Bonus is that they appear in the correct order in the component library as well, which is handy. So I've just chucked those in there for now. Now, what you've noticed here is this is the size of a mobile web browser. I mean, chances are it will act as though it's really tall because that's what scrolling does. But the way that I've just plonked these objects onto the canvas, this isn't really how a web page works. Really, what a web page does is if you have a bunch of text and a logo, it will all be crammed up in the top left-hand corner of the page. It won't be positioned with specific X and Y coordinates like it is in Penpot. So one of the first things that I like to do if I'm trying to design for the web, and this also works for apps and other layouts with fixed viewport sizes, is I want to start off by making Penpot mimic how the browser works. And so I'm going to do that with a flex layout. Now what I do is I set a flex layout that flows from top to bottom, because on the web things are displayed linearly and left aligned or top aligned. But of course, if you're working in right to left layout, you could do it the other way around. That's also possible. And I'll set it with 0 gaps and 0 padding. And this just kind of mimics the web page experience. But what it also means is that now when I create flex layouts inside of this board, it gives me the option to make those layouts fill the full width of the board, which is really handy, as you will see. So now again, you might have noticed that because I've set it to run from top to bottom, my objects are out of order. So I'm just going to use the arrow keys again on the layers to quickly reorder them. So quick, so easy. And so this is the beginning of my navigation. Right, what do I want to do now? Background color. And that way we can actually see the padding. So first up, I'm going to add a flex layout to my navigation itself. So I can do this by right-clicking and adding a flex layout, or I can do this by going to the design panel and adding a layout here. And again, this is just automatically given me some settings based on how my objects were already arranged. I'm going to name my layer because I'm Laura and I like to keep things organized. And let's give it a background fill color. Nice light blue. Okay. First of all, I want to put a bit of padding in there. I want to be able to make sure people don't click on the wrong link. A bit of padding around the outside, give it a bit of room to breathe on both sides too. So I've got this tiny little navigation, but it's not really fitting the available space. And I do that by, so here's my flex element options. So the flex element options appear when your flex layout is inside another flex or grid layout. It will say grid element if it's inside a grid layout. Now I have the option here to position my items statically or absolutely. We'll come to that later. And so I can either set them to be a fixed width. That's when you just choose the pixel width that you want. You drag it to the position you want and decide that's the width I want this layout. I can have it to fit the content. So right now it's filling the width of the widest object inside, which is the logo, with the spacing around it. Or I can make it fill all of the width, which is what I want to do. I only want the navigation to be as tall as the objects inside the navigation. So I'm going to keep this option to fit content, the vertical option as well. So now I've got a nice little navigation going on. Maybe I want to put a bit more space between my logo and the rest of the text. Now what I could do is I could set specific layout options for the logo itself, but because I know it's going to come in handy later, I'm actually going to wrap all of my navigation in another flex layout. I'm going to call this links. And so this list of links, I can add a bit more padding to the top of there. So I'm going to say 10. So it's giving it a little bit more room. What I might want to do is I might decide there's actually a huge amount of empty space here. And maybe it makes more sense to have the navigation links run from left to right. So in my links, I might choose, okay, go left to right. Now there's not very much spacing in between them horizontally, so I'm going to add a bit more there. And oh no, this blog link has jumped off the edge. I'm going to set the content to wrap. And what this will do, once I've fixed the width, so I've set the content to wrap around if it's overflowing the box that it's in. Right now, because the box is set to fit the content, the wrapping is not going to have any effect. But if I set it to fit the width of the container that it's in, there we go. So it's filling the whole width of its navigation layer with the spacing taken into account, and then it's wrapping things around. And I think that is quite a nice, that's a pleasing navigation. It's not taking up too much space, but it's still easy to be able to choose each of the elements as well. Now I will, when you want to test navigations like this across different sized viewports, so getting into the responsive side of things, I mean, this is designed responsively, but I want to be able to see how it's going to work on other viewports. I find one of the best things to do is create a component from your layout. That way you can keep making changes to one instance of it and see how it updates across the others. And so next I will add another board, and I'm going to make this board a different size. I'll make it the size of a massive iPhone. So there we go, Pro Max, humongous. It's actually not that different in width, but that's different enough. And so bigger mobile. And then I can just copy the component across. Now, when you set a, of course, it's not filling the full width because there's no flexed layout on this container in the same way that there is here. So guess what I'm going to do? Copy paste properties again. That really handy feature. Already saving me so much time. So now I've added, by copy pasting the properties, I've added a flex layout, just a simple one, to this board. Now I can set this navigation to be full width. And look, on this slightly bigger mobile, The Flex layout doesn't even need to wrap because it's got enough space to have all of the links with exactly the right amount of padding around it. I couldn't have planned that better. I didn't even plan that. I'm pretty pleased about that. Right. How about we want to now test this navigation on an even wider layout, something that's a bit more like a laptop or a desktop view. So let's chuck in another board, and that will be the web size. Scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. I'm just going to go for the smallest one so we can see what we're doing. And so I'm going to, again, copy the properties, copy pasting layouts such a times over. You would not believe. So I'm just going to call this laptop. Small laptop, but laptop nonetheless. That's actually probably more the size of a tablet. That's going to rename that tablet. And paste in my component, make my component full width. And now we can start seeing where our layout design is less effective because you've got all this empty space up here. It's not really ideal. And I would say this is probably the point at which you're like, okay, I'm going to set some slightly different rules for slightly wider layouts for my component. When you do this, you could just change the layout of this specific component instance, but that's not really helpful when it comes to the development process or even yourself working on this later down the line. I'm actually going to detach the component and create a new component. And of course, navigation wide, and I've just used the keyboard shortcut to turn that into a component as well. You can just do that also by right-clicking, and you can right-click and detach an instance or create a component. And I'm going to, for my wide navigation, I want, rather than going from top to bottom, I'm going to make my navigation run left to right, start to end. Now that's a bit funky that I've got a misalignment here. Now I can do this center alignment, but I've realized that won't make a difference because what did I do earlier? I added padding to the top of my navigation. So that's going to offset it all by accident. So I'll take that out. Now I've got some nice center alignment going on. Now my links are currently filling all of the available width, but maybe I don't want that anymore because maybe I want to align my links to the right of the page. So I'm going to set my links to only fill the width of its content. So that's what that's doing now. And I'm going to go back to my navigation, the overriding container. And at the moment, the layout I've got is lay all of its contents, justify them to the start of the layout. I want to space between them. And what that will do is push both objects to the outer edges of my layout. And so that looks a lot more like a useful layout for a wider view. So there we go. We've got a responsive navigation layout working with just a couple of components and a bunch of Flex layouts. So does anyone have any questions regarding Penpot Flex layouts? You're all very quiet today. Give me a shout in the comments if you have any questions. Great. How would you fix the vertical alignment of the text as it currently looks not centered correctly? Now, I wonder if that was just before I fixed the padding. Let me have a look. This is looking. That is aligned, isn't it? Oh, where's my guides? I always forget the keyboard shortcut. There we go. Yeah, that's looking aligned. So I think that was before you must have asked that question just before I asked that. So yeah, it was because I'd added some padding to the layer here. Generally, if you want to make them vertically centered, this was something that everyone spent forever trying to fix before Flex layouts came along on the web, is how do I align items to the center? It was a big deal. We used to offset things by 3 pixels at the top and 2 pixels at the bottom in order to align icons to text. And now you can just press a button. It's really straightforward. So do we have any other questions regarding Flex layouts? Any problems that you're having with yours? Let's see. And you can just ask in the comments of whatever platform that you're on. So that should appear then in the comments. No? Okay then. So we will move on to Flexception, as I like to call it. And Flexception is nesting flex layouts inside other flex layouts. So let me move to another area. Gosh, we're making lots today. And go past here. Right. Now, I have a component that I made earlier here, and I'm going to pull that component into my design. So I'm going into the Assets panel, and I'm going to find my little card and drag that in. So I thought the next thing I wanted to show you, it would be easier to recreate something that already exists. So I can show you what we're aiming for. Because I think a lot of the time we kind of have an idea in our head of how we want something to look, and it's much easier if we're recreating it. So we're going to recreate this recipe card. And this is built up of many different flex layouts inside each other. And that's why I thought it would be a good example of Flexception. So let's start off by just creating a little board for this card. You can see it's this kind of lovely terracotta-y color. And let's stick the fill image on there already as well. So I'll add another fill. I'm going to add an image fill. I'm going to choose an image off my computer. It's one I made earlier. And it's just a kind of grainy spaghetti image. And I will name this recipe card recreation. So you can tell the difference between what was made earlier and what is being a recreation. Now this board has some rounded corners. I'll add those in. So that's the basics, right? Next up, we want to add our text. So we're just going to stick some text in. It says recipes. I really made this as simple as I could, so you didn't have to watch me typing too much. Spaghetti puttanesca, is that how you say it? I apologize to any Italians. And I also apologize for the text here, and if I got it wrong, and puttanesca doesn't come from Naples. That was a quick search I did to get it right. And maybe we've got a little bit of text for a star rating, the quality of the recipe, and maybe the progress, how far you've gone with creating that recipe yourself. Now, here are some text styles I made earlier. So in my little typographies panel, I have some text styles for the meta. I make that white. And I have text style for the body text. I'm going to make that white as well, but I'm going to give that a little alpha. It picks up the color from behind it quite nicely. This is a title, to make that white. I can also pick the colors from my color palette as well if I wanted. So the recipe text, that's a category name, and my colors from my file library. And I can go through and go, oh, what color? White. Not very exciting. And now I'm going to drag in these little icons. So I've got these already in my assets folder. I have a little food icon, I have a star icon, and I have a filled check icon. And those conveniently are already the right color. Oh, that's 100%. Attention to detail, Laura. Right. I've just thrown these items onto the board randomly. Now what I could do is I could painstakingly drag them around to exactly the values where I want it to be. But that's not much good on the web. And that's not much good when it comes to code, because a developer is going to have to recreate that and is going to have to design essentially how that should work responsively. Whereas if you design the flex layout in your here in Penpot, you can decide what the rules are and how things should flex and change depending on specific widths. Even if you are the developer as well, like I'm a designer and a developer, you can set all of these rules at this stage, meaning that you can concentrate on the data and the other sort of back-end important stuff when you get to the code stage. So let's start off with, as we often do, creating a layout to the entirety of the board. And as I like to do it, I like to run from top to bottom because that is the linear order of how content is presented on the web as well. And let's just give it a little bit of space in between each item. And let's give ourselves a little bit of padding around the outside of our object. I'm going to keep this being a fixed width and height right now. I think that's the best we can do for now, but we'll try something out a bit later on as well. Now, I have all of these random things not really collected together. When you start thinking about flex layouts, what I like to do is look at which objects should be grouped together, which objects are aligned to each other. So for example, this recipes text and this little noodly spaghetti icon, they're both aligned to the top of the card. So it kind of makes sense that they're in a group together. So I'm going to take this. It's almost like this is a category name and a category icon. So I'm going to add a flex layout, which automatically groups the items as well. And I'm going to say category. And to start off with, I'm going to align that from left to right. Let me move it up in the order. And I'm going to switch the order of those two items as well. We're getting there. Now we want this to appear, this noodly icon, on the right side. So I'm going to make the container for category fill the whole width of its container. And then I'm going to set the layout to, like we did with the navigation, set the space between. So distribute any space we've got in between the items. So there we go, that's already aligned. Next up, we have this little checkbox and the star. Now these are actually, this is meta information, all of this stuff together. So first up, I'll group that with a flex layout, and I'm going to call this meta. That actually goes at the end. Might as well put this in the right order now. And the meta is kind of like this, except it's pushed at the bottom. So it's also going to be full width. We want it to only be the height of its contents. And then we want to organize the completion and the star rating together. So the star rating is 4.3, and these are going to be grouped because that's the label for the star. So I'm going to call this star rating. And again, this is a left to right layout. We want to put a little bit of space in between that and maybe vertically center them. And the same, in fact, I'm going to copy these properties, create a flex layout, and paste these properties. I love that. So much time saved. And so this is my completion. And now you can see that these are the width of their contents, and they're running from top to bottom. But in this layout, we want them to run from left to right. So I change that, and they're the wrong way around. And I'll make sure, just in case, they look okay to me right now, but I'm just going to double check that they're aligned to the center, you know, belt and braces and all that, and put a bit of spacing in between those items. So now that is laid out well. Now we've got this kind of spacing between, you see this often in card layouts, where not all the content is aligned to the top of the card, and there's a bit of white space added in between, makes it a bit more dynamic, actually allows for a bit more text, without having to change the size of the card as well. So I want to find a way of introducing this space in. So we have this category section at the top, that's pushed to the top, but all of this other content is grouped at the bottom. So I'm actually going to call this content, and I'm going to group it. So you don't have to just add a flex layout, you can group like this, call it content, and then add a flex layout to it. I think right-clicking and adding flex layout is quicker, but if you haven't decided yet and you still want to start grouping and thinking about grouping, you can do it that way. And there's a little bit of spacing in between these items, although there's not in between here and here. So I'm going to add some padding into the top of my meta. I'm just eyeballing this, not being very accurate. So I've got these two objects inside my card, and I want to add space in between them, but vertically. So we've already looked at using space between distributing horizontal items, but we can also do it when we're running from top to bottom and do it vertically like that. And so there we have it, our card. And this card is responsive. Now, again, before I do this, I'm going to add my disclaimer. I'm about to change the width of the board. What this will do is all of these items inside the board that are set to fill the width of the board, they will be set to a fixed width as well because I've changed the width of the board. So if you test your responsiveness like this, make sure you go back and undo it afterwards. So, but you can see this is my responsive little card. Undo. So that is my disclaimer done. So, do we have any questions? I think it's time that we head on to the Flex Doctor. Please, can you demonstrate how to make an element within the Flex layout absolutely positioned? Oh, Anthony, you're fantastic because you have anticipated a question that I had saved in case no one asked any questions. So that's great. Okay, so let me do it with the recipe card, but I don't want to break this. So I'm going to duplicate it so we can play with this one. Right. So often you have these flex layouts and you want stuff to flex and fit depending on the contents or the box that it's in or something like that. Sometimes you have an object that is inside here that you always want to be stuck to a particular position relative to its container. So that could be, for example, some kind of image or graphic, I think is probably when you're most likely to do that, because you probably wouldn't do it with text because it might get like overlaid by other text or something like that. So let's grab some random icon and stick it in there. So we'll go for box icon. Yeah, what about this little contrast icon? It's called adjust. Where did it end up? There we go. So you see I've dragged this icon in and it's now, it's not very big, make a difference. Let's make it a bit bigger. So it's now completely upset the layout of my thing. Well, actually it hasn't upset it. It still looks good because flex, but it's changed the layout from what I wanted it to be. Maybe this is a really big icon as well. And maybe I just want it to appear in the background. It's a bit more subtle. It's like 40% opacity. So what I do with that is, because it is inside a flex layout, so I can see that it's a child layer of this recipe card recreation layer. I have the options here to position it statically, which means it will sit inside of the flex layout, or absolutely. So if I hit absolute, what you'll see immediately is that all of the other objects suddenly are ignoring my object that's absolutely positioned. And so that's what absolute positioning does. And it means that my object will be positioned according to its X and Y coordinates here. If I go into another flex object, so this is a flex object that is inside the layout. You see here, the X and the Y coordinates are disabled. They're telling me where they are, but they're disabled. And that's because you're not setting those values manually. You're letting the flex layout choose where where the object appears. Whereas this one, because I'm positioning it absolutely, I can say, well, actually, I maybe want to move it over a little bit. Maybe I want to move it down a little bit. I can actually just drag it around and it will just sit there and be exported like that. And I can change the width of the card and those coordinates will stay the same. The next question you might have is, what if I don't want that to appear in the background? Maybe I want that absolute object to appear over the top of the other text. And this is where this little Z comes in, or Z. And this is the Z index or Z index if you're not British. And so this positions, the Z index is a way of ordering your content. Automatically, the objects that are higher up in this layer order will appear higher up in the kind of 3D plane. But if you want to change that, you can use the Z index to do it. So maybe I want to give it a Z index of 2. And so immediately it's pulling it out of the order of all of the other content. And it's hard to see because it's 40%, 100%. You can tell now because I've pulled it out and it's above, it's overlapping the text instead of underlying it. You can also use negative Z index as well. It can get very confusing though. So I kind of recommend using this very sparingly, but for situations like this, I can see that it would be useful. Do we have any other questions related to Flex? Can you work with fractions or percentages if you want to have one object filling 1/3 and one element 2/3 of the container width? I love this. This is another question that I'd anticipated. I'm so glad about this. So yes, you can. But if you want to work with fractions, I would recommend using grid layout instead. Grid layout is perfect for this. So for example, let me chuck this together very quickly. So I have a board here. I'm going to say layout with fractions so we can remember why I did it. And we have got a few boxes. And I'm going to add grid layout. Now let's make the spacing even. Okay. And the board is fixed height and width. Now let's go to edit grid. By default, this is actually fractions. This is what this FR unit is. And so this is saying I want this to be there's going to 3 1 fractions in this. Does that make sense? 3 instances of 1 fraction. So basically the width of these areas will be divided equally between the width of the board. And in these columns, you can also choose that one of the fractions is 2, whereas the other 2 are 3. The same goes for percentages. You can choose different units here, and you can say, hey, I want this to be 50%, and then the remaining space available will be divided equally between these next 2 columns. Now it'll be easier to see if I just make the rectangles fill their space as well. So this is how you would do fractions, and you can do the same with rows as well. So that's a really great question. So if you want to have equal sized or proportional widths and heights, that's what grid is for. Do we have any more questions for the Flex Doctor? I wish I had a stethoscope or a coat or something like that right now. Any more questions related to Flex layouts? Now, I will share this file, as I mentioned earlier, in the Penpot community afterwards. And if you think of any questions or you're struggling with something in your own design related to Flex or related to anything else in Penpot, please just jump on the community and ask your question there. I'll be in there. There's loads of other great people in the community there that are also helping each other out. And so we can solve these problems easily together. We can get around it. So if you do have any other questions, you can ask them later or ask them in the comments of the platform that you're on, and I'll see if I can pick them up later too. So do we have any remaining questions? Otherwise, I'll wrap up. Okay, so the next hands-on will be on the 26th of March. That will be a Wednesday, not a Thursday. And we will be looking at interface design with UI kits. I know that UI kits are something that interests a lot of you. The idea that you can build up interfaces really quickly because you have a kit that's made up of all of these existing components. And I'll be showing you some of the great UI kits available to work with Penpot right now and how you can use them really effectively with your design. And don't forget that Penpot 2.5, what a mouthful, is out today. So if you want to try out those cool features that I was using today, like multi-stop gradients, like copying and pasting properties, yes, so useful, copying CSS, and there's much, much more. I recommend you jump right into Penpot today. You know, it's free, you can. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for the questions and the comments that you've added today. These live streams are only worth being live if you're here as well. I really appreciate you, and I will see you next time.